Julie.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Julie Blankenship. Probably know many of you. I'm just going to give a hi. Hey, Colette. I'm just going to, Eleni, I can't see everyone, but hi to you all. And I'm just going to give a very brief introduction for Jeremy because so many of us know him and he has a lot to say. And I'm so excited to hear his talk. Jeremy was born in Cambridge, England, and his dad was a professor, and through him, he met lots of artists and was inspired. His dad was an amateur watercolor painter, and Jeremy was fascinated by watching him, paint. And eventually, Jeremy made his way to the Ruskin School of Drawing at the University of Oxford in the 70s and on to the very prestigious Royal Academy, where he got his undergrad degree. He received the prestigious Harkness Fellowship, and with that was able to come to the United States to travel and kind of open his mind more, which he says everyone should travel and it always changes you. And he made his way to San Francisco, which is, as you know, kind of the edge of the Western world. And he's felt a very deep affinity with Asian art and the principles of Asian art, and he'll expand more on that. He was hired, after he graduated in '85, he was hired as the rack room manager after he graduated, and that's where I met him. He would, I remember clearly an image of Jeremy. I was a student at the time, and he graduated before me, and he was like down on his knees teaching some student to stretch canvas. And he was always very, very generous with his time and his knowledge and sharing. And the rack room was kind of like a social center, and it was like the coolest people were hanging out there with Jeremy, of course. And he began teaching at SFAA in 1989 and became an associate professor of painting. At some time he was head of the department, and he was a professor, as you know, until recent events. He also taught at JFK University in San Francisco in the Arts and Consciousness program, and at CCA in Oakland. And he's given tons of workshops in China, and is also affiliated with the Lucid Art Foundation in California as a vision board member. He's exhibited internationally, particularly in the US, UK, and China, and his work is represented in many private collections and in many personal collections by individual art collectors. Sorry, I didn't say that very well at the end there, but I'm very delighted to introduce Jeremy Morgan to you all. Take it away, Jeremy.
Thank you, Judy, very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I will try to keep this within the hour we have. And basically, I just want to share with you, take this opportunity to share. Many of you know me pretty well, some less well, but I just want to take you on a journey. We're all on our journeys as artists at various stages. One of the great joys of teaching in an art school like the Art Institute and other institutions was meeting people who were starting on some kind of, I like to think of it as an odyssey, whether it's a career path, whether it's an ideological journey, whatever it might be, helping people understand who they are, why they are, and what they're doing on this planet, and how they can contribute and understand aspects of life more fully. And I think that's one of the sort of unwritten gifts of art in general. Anyway, I'm going to start, if I can. I will ask Maria Teresa to begin. If I will ask you to give me a few minutes of your time, we're going to go to the next slide, and you'll see some writing there. I'm going to leave you to read that. Or maybe I'll read it because then, it's coming from my voice, but it's from a writer, René Huet. It's a wonderful French historian and cultural historian. When I read this, I just thought if I had an epitaph, a long one, this is what I would have, because it explains to me, or explains my view of why I think art is important. We know only two realities, the one around us and the one within us. The first reality is the universe. The second is the life of the psyche. Communication from the first to the second is affected through the senses and the messages which they register, while communication from the second to the first is made through action, action which enables us to project our forces into the outside world and to observe the consequences. But even if the two realities are thus brought together, there remains an irreducible disparity between them. That which is around us appears to be disposed in space, but that which is within us unfolds and is felt in time. There lies perhaps the main mystery of the world, the impossible abyss which separates the two sides, the side where the self lives and the opposite, the side where the other extends. Yet man, I'll put in human, has discovered the means by which the two sides may merge together in a most subtle way, and this is in the work of art. For he, she, they projects and inserts into it the very substance of their inner life, which thus becomes inscribed in space as both image and object, perceptible to others. And although this work of art is made of materials and dimensions borrowed from the outside world, it reflects images born of sight and memory that show the world transformed. Thus, the work of art, far from being ornament, oh, I'm so sorry, far from being ornament, oh, excuse me 1 second. Oh, that was not planned. I do beg your pardon. And although this work of art is made of materials and dimensions borrowed from the outside world, it reflects images born of sight and memory that showed the world transformed. Thus, the work of art, far from being ornament, a fanciful addition to reality, lies at the heart of the mystery of being. Anyway, let's move on. Thank you. One of the first images I remember seeing as a young person was in a magazine, and this is Arnold Birkeland's Isle of the Dead, one of about, I think, 12 versions of this painting. When I saw it, I was transfixed. Its strangeness, its drama, its mood, but what appealed to me about it was the kind of ambiguity of it. It was something I could see, but I couldn't understand. And I found that immediately attractive. And some years later, many years later, after seeing this image for the first time, I saw not this painting, but another version of it in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And I stood transfixed in front of the painting because finally this image I carried in my head for years was now in front of me. And its power became all the more magnificent. And I stood there so quietly and still that one of the docents came up to me and said, "Are you okay, sir?" And I said, yes, I am. He said, "I was just concerned because I once had a person look at this piece that was so overwhelmed they actually went into a kind of semi-coma, and I had to wake them up." I said, "I can see why." When I read about this painting, it was done for a commission by a woman who's lost her husband, who was an aristocrat in, I think, Switzerland. And it was a long and happy marriage, and she was in the stages of grief. And she met Birkeland and asked if he might make a painting to commemorate his life. And this is what he came up with. And for me, I often think about, and I just mentioned this to some of my colleagues before the talk started, about when I'm painting, I'm aware of and think about time a lot. And this painting is one of those pieces that started to make me think in those terms. Yes, it's a space, it's a landscape, and that takes on many connotations and meanings. And landscape is something I have has a natural appeal for me. And it was instigated by both the natural world I lived in and by images such as this. Go to the next slide, please. The other early hero of mine was Turner. My father, as Judy remarked, was a professor of political and human geography, but also a physical geographer, but also a very good amateur painter. And he loved Turner. And I think that's an influence I took on early on very happily. And I think that when I saw Turner and I watched, his evolution from being basically a colorer of engravings to then becoming an artist in his own right, I felt this wonderful sense of an uncertainty in his work about the idea of what he was actually painting beyond the obvious. And there's this idea of what we see and what we sense. And our way of looking is such a personal and subjective thing. But when I saw these works, both by Böcklin and by Turner, I began to realize the idea of an inner life or the psychological realms rather than merely an optical recording of the world. And opticality is vital and important, but it's but one part of the experience of perceiving and seeing. And painting was a way I began to understand, and other things later, cinema, music, and other things. But painting was the way, the prism through which I began to see the world could be apprehended and understood in multiple ways. Next slide, please. In the Rain, Steam and Speed, and this is one of Turner's paintings which deals with the idea of the age of industrialization in the UK and Great Britain at that time, the birthplace in many senses of the industrial age. And Turner, as one of a group of loosely described romantic artists, which cover many European schools, or countries rather, was probably one of the most important painters of the end of what I call the theocratic age and the beginning of the anthrocentric. Now, in art history terms, in the Western art world, the Renaissance is the birthplace of humanism and the shift from a theocratic worldview to an anthrocentric one. But in a later period, in the industrial age, is the idea of how the notion of God as an omnipotent force was now in many senses philosophically, ideologically, and spiritually under question, if not threat. And the industrialization of the world gave humans an inordinately large sense of their own power, which I think is a foundation of what we now call climate change. And I think that these things are very important. And Turner was essentially an artist of the cosmic. Next slide, please. His counterpart was John Constable, another landscape painter of the English scene. And I just want to compare and contrast these two because Turner painted the cosmic, and he also painted the transition point between the era of sail power in terms of marine life and the idea of natural energy as opposed to industrial. So the Rain, Steam and Speed was really an essay on the idea of the modern age, the steam train being exemplification of the modern age, piercing the natural energies of the universe. By contrast, Constable painted largely the landscape of his youth. That is, at the time he was painting, industrialization meant that farm workers were losing their long-lived rights to be on the land and work for the farmers working manually. Their labor was replaced by machinery, and there was a great deal of tumult in the English landscape at the time. And the landscapes painted by Constable describe none of this, but they describe beautifully the facts and acts of nature. Next slide, please. So I began to realize that the landscape was a motif, a form of understanding the environment which we came from, to which we might look. But in terms of Constable, the sort of serenity of this image, which is of course the Hayway, many of you will know this image. A quick note here too is that these two landscape painters were revolutionary in terms of landscape painting in the Western tradition because they were going out into the field to paint rather than painting from drawings or engravings or from ideas. They were optically situated in the landscapes they went to. Turner was a prodigious walker, would walk scores of miles a day to see landscape he wanted to paint. Filled sketchbooks all the way, every time he moved. Constable painted one small part of the southeastern corner of England, the Suffolk area. And he painted the landscape as if he was painting a beloved person or being. He treated the landscape as a mode of a kind of a love affair with the natural world. And he believed deeply in it. But what's important to note here is that had you and I, at that same point, without his connections, gone wandering into the English countryside, we would have been under threat of being trespassers. Constable's father was a mill owner and had a direct contact with all the farms in the area. So John Constable could walk through the fields and have a contact with nature that was unheard of at the time by most people. And these facts become very interesting when you start to look at these images and realize that they carry with them many implications. Next slide, please. In my own landscape from the southwest of England, having born in Cambridge, my father and mother moved to Bristol in the southwest, where he became a university lecturer and professor of geography, human and political. But he had an abiding love of the landscape, and it's a very common practice in those days in Britain for people who had the means to go out with their cars or on buses to the landscape. And we went out on Sunday trips more often than not. But this is a group of standing stones in a place called Stanton Drew, which basically means Druid standing stones. And my family, part of my family, who were farm workers, goes back. I can find gravestones in the churchyard. In the church there at the back is a churchyard. And family members died as early as 1690, and I can see their gravestones. So it gave me a very strong sense of connectedness to the land and to that space. Next slide, please. In the 60s, when I was about 11, my father, who was really a frustrated architect, had a desire to find some kind of property that he could, do up and have fun with as a sort of serious project. He didn't have money enough as a lecturer to just buy property and get into property that way, but he also wanted somewhere where the family could go and have reasonably priced vacations. So in the 60s, the British government were buying up huge tracts of upland in Wales and Scotland in the UK to build, or rather plant, man-made forests, which were then going to be cultivated for use in the paper mill industry and pit props and other necessities. Now, in that process, they bought up farms. They weren't compulsory purchase bought, they were bought when lands became available. So they bought the land. But the reaction from people in the landscape was one of intolerance because these were seen as invaders. And this photograph is very important for me because it denotes the end of an era. And it's important in terms of my relationship to landscape that I see it both in a romantic sense and in a political sense, in its broadest sense. European artists often paint the land, for the most part, in terms of the territories it represents. Not always, but often with the idea of ownership, of who owns that land. As we'll see later, Asian artists tend to look through a different lens at the landscape, and that's for very many different reasons. Turner and Constable, for me, were exemplars of another way of dealing with the landscape, which was to recognize its physical beauty, but also its potential symbolism. Anyway, in this landscape, I got to spend time. We'd go up every spring and summer vacation because my father was an academic. We had long vacations. And we would go to this place, which had no electricity, was a functioning sheep farm, and was still being farmed by the shepherd that lived in that cottage before we moved in. He voluntarily left the cottage. The owner of the land bought him a house down in the valley as a retirement present, and he was ready in his mid-80s to retire, but I met him in his mid-80s, and he became my third grandfather. He took me across the landscape on daily trips, doing various things that farmers do, and I fell in love with the whole process of being in that landscape and having his knowledge of the land. And one memorable moment, he took me onto the top of this mountain on horseback in the spring, very early morning, because the sheep that were giving birth were having trouble. Some were breech birthing. And when they do that, sheep will lie on their back with their legs in the air. They clearly look distressed. And he got off his horse mumbling, and he went up to them, he talking to me, and he said, "This one's breech birthing." And I said, "What do we do?" And he took my hand on top of his and put it into the ewe, and we found the lamb's head and we pulled the lamb out. And I'm holding this steaming goo-covered lamb at the very beginning of its life outside its mother's body. And I'm totally overwhelmed by the beauty of this moment, this little tiny creature, which is now going to be alive because we helped it become alive. We've wrapped the umbilical cord that's around the neck, given it to the mother, who then starts to lick it. And then William says to me, "We need to go back with the horses and get the tractor up here and bring these animals back down to the barn." And I said, "Okay." He said, "We need to cover these ones we're seeing now with sacks," which we did. And I said, "Is that to keep them warm?" He said, "No, it's to stop the crows eating the eyes of the lambs and their tongues." And at that moment, in this great moment of natural beauty, dawn on the Welsh mountain hillside, I came into contact with the capricious aspect of the natural world. Life and death have a close proximity. They are inevitable partners. And that was the foundation of my realization of both the power, beauty, and terror of the natural world as a magnificent force, which we have to adjust and learn to live with. And at that moment, I think my fate was sealed as an artist, that the land and such provinces of the land would be my main interest. Next slide, please. So this is the cottage itself, a little viaduct in the background there, just the most beautiful spot. And it became somewhere I spent many happy months, and it forged my relationship with the natural world, walking through rainstorms, looking at rivers, and watching things in general in the landscape. And with walks with my father we took as a family, I might look across the valley and say, "Why is that waterfall there?" My father explained to me about geomorphology and geology and all of those things. And I realized this landscape had been covered by ice, as much part of the northern part of America was during the Ice Age. And so what I was looking at in the landscape was a chronology of the evolution of time and space. and the temporal nature of trees growing and leaves falling off and wind blowing and rain coming and going was set against the geologic logic age. And then I began to understand the theories that came out of the idea of, I think by James Hutton, on deep time, the idea of the geological and cosmological measuring points rather than one's own life, like looking at the stars or the ocean to understand the magnitude of things in relationship to the human and seeing the relative positions of things. So all of these are playing out as I'm moving through the landscape and thinking various thoughts. Next slide, please. This tree is on the back of my yard, and I was talking to my father told me about, on many talks, he started talking to me about feng shui, the Chinese principles of geomancy. And in that moment, I realized that the Chinese view the world as a spiritual space as well as a physical one. When I told this to William, he said, well, we have a kind of feng shui in Wales. And I said, well, what do you possibly mean? I was like 12, and he's telling me Welsh had feng shui. And I said, no, that can't be. He said, you see the oak tree there, which is this one here? I said, yes. He said, that was planted 300 years ago when the house was built. It was planted to ward off the effects of witchcraft. And I said, oh, sorry, the devil. I said, oh, okay. He said, it's a sign of good luck, good fortune. And around that tree, a series of ash trees, which I haven't photographed, which are still there to this day in a pentangle. And that was to ward off the effects of witchcraft. So I thought, so that's a Christian space and a pagan space. It's a space that is timeless, but these different veils have been put over it. So these things began to make me think about what I was seeing and what was invisible. Next slide, please. Next slide, we carry on. These are just views from, in a sense. My early attempt as a landscape painter, not a very good photograph, but the painting is actually quite nice. It's not very big. It's like 14 by 8 inches. Plein air, I did a lot of plein air painting in the Welsh Hills. And there was something about the horizon that was beginning to have an effect on me. I would walk often, when I made this painting, I'd walk across for about half a day to the point which is the horizon in the painting and paint where I'd come from. So I had an understanding of what I was painting when I was painting it, not as an image, but as an experience. And that was very important, how I internalized my motion through the landscape. Next slide, please. When I came to see Chinese painting for the first time, it was again through my father's publications he got sent from China, which were often sort of Maoist propaganda about the great Chinese enterprise and the new country and everything else. But within it were embedded images of art, folk art, which is contemporary, some Soviet socialist style realist painting, which I didn't really care for, and these kind of images, which mesmerized me. This is Ma Yuan, one of the great Southern Song Dynasty painters. I'll ask you to move on, please, next. And this is by Fan Quan, the Northern Song Dynasty. When I went to the Ruskin, I went and studied as part of my art history education beyond the Western canon, Asian art. And I had the great privilege working with the keeper of Asian art, who I'd visit once a week and spend several hours with. And he, in this case, would take me through scroll painting, fan painting, everything else, and gave me a big introduction to the notion of Chinese painting. When I saw it, this painting I've yet to see, it's very large, it's Fan Quan, Traveller Amongst the Mountains, one of the sort of iconic Chinese paintings of Song Dynasty. But there was a British sinologist, Arthur Waley, a poet and lover of Chinese culture, who described, I thought beautifully, the deafening silence of Chinese painting. And I love that notion, that very sort of paradoxical title. But anyway, what I began to realize looking at Chinese painting as opposed to Western painting was this whole idea of how space is announced in a painting. In a Western tradition of, the Renaissance forward, we look at a painting at the beginning of the Renaissance. Prior to the Renaissance was the idea of a perspective which is based on a scale of authority or hierarchy of importance. God is the largest being, therefore features the biggest in the painting. Normal people, everyday people at the bottom, like little ants. So that's a social perspective. Then with the advent of geometry and understanding of geometry was the idea of illusion of depth and space becomes this fantastic moment. So in Renaissance painting, you have the classic Renaissance painting is to be viewed essentially as two pyramids. I want you to think your eye looking at a Raphael painting or a Leonardo, your eye is one vanishing point and forms a pyramid which reaches the surface of the painting. The vanishing point in the painting is a correspondence to your own eye point. And so what you have is Renaissance painting is based on spectatorial distance. It's a separation of where you are and what it is you're seeing. And the illusion of depth. It's fantastic, but it's actually quite kind of intrusive in the sense it's like you can never be where it is you're looking. You can only wonder and look towards it. And various conventions happened by other artists, and we changed that relationship to space in the West. But in China, they didn't have that structure. They had forms of linear perspective, but their interest in perspective was to do with viewing point. Perspectiva, the original word means to see through. So in the Renaissance, I want you to touch on this too. I want to touch on this to make a point about, for me, these are important moments as painting began to assume a significance in my life. In the Renaissance, there's the confluence of three words: ousia, phenomena, perspectiva. So what happens in the Renaissance is that moment where the perceived image is one which is, ousia means essentially, it's a complex philosophical term. So for the philosophers out there, I apologize, this is going to be a crude summary, but essentially a consciousness of a realm of possibility of being is what ousia really connotes. The realm of all possibilities within which we have the appearance through which we see. That's the moment painting becomes a very distinct form of expression as articulated in the West, and a very important moment of concretizing the spiritual, the immaterial, the philosophical, the sensual, and physical world. Anyway, next slide, please. Li Chen, another great painter of the landscape. And here I want you to think about the idea that in the Northern Song dynasty, the Chinese were interested in the idea of dragon veins, which we have in the West, ley lines, magnetic fields. There's various commensurate ways of thinking. But for the Chinese, for those of you who probably know, that they don't have the same theocratic base as we have in the Abrahamic traditions. The Abrahamic traditions, Judeo-Christian, Muslim, have God the creator in whatever form his name is. It's the creator. We are then in a made universe. China does not have that concept. China has the notion of Tao, which is a very complex thing to actually try to reduce to any sort of sensible analysis. But essentially, it's a form of understanding that Tao is the way. The Tao is the unproduced production of everything that ever is and ever will be. And what is in the beginning becomes then manifestation, which then returns to nothingness. Not nothing, but nothingness. That distinction is important. Next slide, please. The other forms in Chinese art and Japanese art and Korean art which interest me were the idea of screen scrolls and other forms of art other than a rectangle. And I want to just go backwards a little bit here and think about this idea. I've been thinking about a lot of paint, and I shared some of this with some of my more recent students, is this idea, when we see the world, we see through a circle. Our ancient forebears lived in landscapes without buildings. They lived in caves, they made structures temporal or otherwise, and they moved in landscape, space, and time. Then after hunter-gathering, they began to understand they could breed animals, they could plant things, and they became relatively sedentary. And when they became sedentary, they built structures in which to live. Those structures required portals through which we walked or looked. That's the beginning of the format, the edge that we all have to deal with, whether photographers, filmmakers, what have you. If you are dealing with a point of viewing, you have to understand the extent and the termination point. Now, the Chinese through scroll painting and the Japanese through scroll painting, and that's a whole subject under itself for another lecture. But essentially, the scroll painting allowed people, remember when you see a scroll presented to you normally in an exhibition, it's been unrolled. That is not how it's supposed to be read. There's hand scrolls and then there are wall scrolls. The hand scrolls are like reading a book, each chapter at a time, or a poem, stanza by stanza, not the totality of it. And so the idea of duration became something I started thinking about, timescapes as well as spatiality. Next slide, please. This happens in various forms. The other thing is, in the era of word and text, the Chinese and the Islamic tradition have done this for a very long time. Persian tradition, before Islam was doing it, writing and images in relationship. Next slide, please. This is one of my all-time favorites. This is attributed to three different people, so I'm not even going to say any one of their names. I'm going to find out exactly who's supposed to be authored this painting. There is some dispute about it, but the point in this talk is to talk about that figure and the space that is occupying in the left-hand section of that image. This is a poet dreaming of immortality. And this is an exemplification of the idea that in my understanding of Chinese painting of the landscape is it is a form of contemplation and connectedness. I used to take trips to China with SFAA students. We had wonderful journeys to China, to Hangzhou, and we go traveling and see the most wonderful things. And they would be involved in calligraphy and painting classes, and I would spend time with them. I went through several of those classes myself, and then I would meet with the students each night after the day's teaching, and we, have dinner and some drinks and maybe some smokes or whatever, and we'd chat about the day. And I said to them at one point, "How's it going?" They said, "It's amazing, but there's something we're missing. And we know we can't understand a 3,000, 5,000-year-old culture in 3 days, but there's something about this process." And I said, "Well, let me read you something that might help you, because I think what you're talking about." And in the writing I read to them was from a translation of an old text, relatively old text from the 50s. He was talking about the Western artist and the Chinese artist from the perspective of a Chinese person contemplating the contrast. And they said, for the Western artist who looks at Chinese artists, there's often not much to see in terms of the lack of color generally, the thinness of application because it's ink on silk or paper rather than on canvas, and the lush fullness of oil paint is absent. And for the Eastern artist looking at the Western artist, it's too full of stuff. Bodies are thick and plasticky, and everything's so heavy. And the writer then said, I think in the West, essentially, the artists are concerned often with emotion and intellect and feeling. And in the Eastern painting, they generally, when a painter is working their work, they are resonating with Tao. It isn't feeling or thought. It's a sense of a kind of awareness of connectedness. And it doesn't mean that that doesn't happen in the West, but in terms of exemplification, I thought it was perfect. There is, in the moment, the language in Chinese and Japanese aesthetics, the verbiage alone is fabulous. The terminologies for words that meet particular kind of experiences are absolutely extraordinary. So anyway, these things were all beginning to filter in. Now, as I came to the Art Institute and when I started teaching there, and Fred Martin, who many of you will remember, was a wonderful friend and mentor and teacher and carer of the school for many, many years. He loved China, and I took over his China trips for him. And, he and I would talk for hours about this. And it was this idea, when I got to China for about the fourth time, I had a chance to watch a student make a painting in front of me. She'd been in my workshop in the morning, an acrylic workshop, and she was a traditional Chinese painter. And I wanted to see, because I was thinking about going back to that idea of the Renaissance surface of the painting and illusion, what in era of abstraction and other processes of visual making, what does the role of surface actually mean anymore beyond the obvious? And I watched this person mixing their ink. I saw the brush go into the ink, which he'd ground with water and from an ink stick, very laborious, brought the brush to the surface of the paper. Chinese paint only horizontally on felt because the paper is so delicate. She put the brush down, and as I watched, the ink went into what was a space. And I thought, energy in space, not marks on surface, not transverse, it's spatiality. And that to me was an aha moment. Next slide, please. By contrast, one of my other heroes is Caspar David Friedrich, one of the great German romantic painters. And here contrasting, firstly, that the Chinese paint mountains very readily, and the interaction between cloudscapes and moisture, which is generally the feminine, and the rocks, which are the males, is part of the whole yin-yang balance. And in most of the mountains of China are softened by the presence of the female energy at the bottom of them. So what would be a phallus in the West is not in China. It doesn't deny the masculine, it just talks about a more natural correlation between the two. Friedrich was a deeply mystical Christian gentleman and deep thinker. His paintings were often used by Nazi propagandists erroneously because he had no interest in Nazism. It's before Nazism came. But he was part of a nationalist movement that was trying to unify a tribal Germany early on in the 19th century or 18th century. It was forming, and the country we now know was not there until recently with Italy. It took time to coalesce. This painting just represents a classic European pyramidic form, which is the ascending triangle. The head breaks the boundary of the landscape, which suggests he's having some sense of connected to the infinite. This is an important moment. The Chinese gentleman was going into space to have the infinite connection. Friedrich is still on the ground, and the man here is not a farmer or shepherd. He looks like a scholar or a gentleman. Civilization, in other words, in the natural world, and the meeting of the pinnacle of civilization and intellect and the power authority of the spiritual in perfect union. Next slide, please. Another thing that influenced me early on, this is a still from a film called The Innocents, based on Henry James Turner the Screw. One of the most frightening films I've ever seen, and I still get scared when I watch it now. I watched this when I was 11, and I couldn't look out of a window for many years after seeing this scene, because the character there is a ghost looking at the young man who probably is going to be haunting this man, and his former lover in also potentially inhabiting this boy's sister. The story is incredible. It's a Freudian dream, but it's an incredibly beautiful film too, beautifully shot and made in general. Next slide, please. And cinema has always been attractive to me. I was talking to my colleagues earlier, this idea that backlight, as a painter, I'm obviously this, how do you light things and where does light come from? And more and more I paint, the more and more I exist, I understand that there's so many different ways light exists. And part of my journey as a painter has been to understand that. Cinema's beauty is its motion and its playfulness with the idea of stillness in motion. But I want to think too, in general terms, about this idea that painting is in a sense, what I call a psychic geology, where in motion, mental, physical, chemical, spiritual, political, social, sexual, coalesce into a form of stasis. And that stasis then is to be reinvigorated. The Max Raphael, a great German critic of the 20s, when asked what a painting was, and this is a crude paraphrase, said essentially, a painting is a meeting place of energies, which are psychic, physical, political, social, sexual, and otherwise, in a form of choreography between materials, time, substance, resistance, staining, hitting, striking, caressing, until something like an image forms. And in that forming, the artist then can retreat from their place of understanding into silence. The painting then remains sentient until it is seen again, and its realizations are recognized by another consciousness as the painting migrates from surface to mind. And I thought, well, that to me is a very nice analysis of what a painting can be. Now, film, because it accords with our sort of sense of the dynamic, is one of those things which I made me realize each moment in art's evolution, painting was affected and liberated by by photography, and photography was liberated by what film could do. Film was liberated by the digital and video, and so it goes on. It's not a race, it's a natural evolution. People say to me, aren't you worried in painting? Why are you painting? As I said, because it's still important. None of these things, printmaking from a potato print through to a lithograph to a digital image, they all matter. We as artists need to find a place where we want to be doing our work. Be aware of what's around us, yes, but pick that which makes sense to you. You have a natural relationship to materials, time, space, and qualities of experience. And so for me, all of these processes, the digital is not a threat to painting. It liberates painting into doing other things and provides painting the opportunities to do things other than merely paint on its own, which is magnificent enough. Anyway, short is to say, I embraced these things, and by looking at films, I understood how painting was different from, and I celebrated that difference as well as similarities. Next slide, please. In my own work as a painter, I did the landscapes, and then when I was at Oxford, I was doing landscapes in the summer, and then I'd come back, and we had a project, which was just one of the projects I picked for, because Oxford has very short term. You have to do a lot of work in the vacations. And the second summer I was going off to the summer, they gave us a project, one of 6, and I picked human being as biomechanical, social, sexual, political, working within certain spatial confines, visually discussed, 6 paintings. So at that point, I'd given up rugby, which I hated because I didn't like ball games, made no sense. And I became a judoka. I did judo with my art teacher. And I went, I got to the national championships as a junior player, and I got to the quarterfinals, my greatest sporting moment. But judo gave me access to Japanese thinking, which in turn took me back to China. There was a route to back. Each culture had its own to offer, but I was going back then to China to understand the judo, which means gentle way, and the do in Japan is the Tao of China, the way, same thing, same meaning. So the martial arts gave me a sense of body movement and time and space. And it was actually Yves Klein, a great French conceptual artist, that was the first European black belt in judo given by the Japanese Buddha choir in, I think, the 1940s. And when I learned that and I read about it, he said, I think I learned more about space as a judo choir than I ever did in a painting class, which I thought was very interesting. Anyway, next slide, please. So I started doing experiments. And what I realized as a moving person in the judo, I then gave up judo and started, when I got to Oxford, I started doing karate, Shotokan karate primarily, which I did for several years. And I loved the kind of formality of it, the movements and everything else. The physical exercise was great, but there was something very aesthetic about it. Yes, it's a martial art, but the fighting is almost immaterial in reality. We're not talking MMA here. We're talking about a philosophical approach to body movements and kinetics. And the fighting is all symbolic. You can get hurt in karate, don't get me wrong, but it's not its intention. It is if you use it as an actual defense system, but the movements of it are basically a form of very muscular ballet, which is much less fluid, but has its own kind of aesthetics. So I had a friend photograph me. These are crude photographs, but they were early photographs of me doing kata forms, which are form pattern design, where you mock out certain movements. And I watched the dissolving form, and that became really intriguing to me. Next slide, please. I'm going to have to speed it up because I think we're a bit slow at the moment. So next slide, please. So these images were all ones I was using. Next slide, please, which will give me information. So this is my first semi-abstract piece I did as an undergrad at the Ruskin. And it was very liberating. It was 6 by 4 feet, which to me was enormous. And I did it on muslin, which was what we call calico, you call muslin. And very, very exciting for me to be doing this. I was all of a sudden, I was beginning to paint things that I actually wouldn't ordinarily see, or was seeing so fast I couldn't possibly capture them. So the photograph gave me access to what was otherwise invisible. Next slide, please. That morphed into more abstractions. And so I began working in a more abstract way, but I was getting too linear. I thought, no, I'm missing something here. I'm not doing, this is exciting, but it's not quite where I need to be. Next slide, please. This was done on a very chalky ground. It's like a fresco, but I really loved the quiet because I was beginning to appeal to me was the thinness of the paint. I paint very thinly, but lots and lots of layers. Next slide, please. Then I made little sculptures of the movements based on the kata, and I like the idea of translating that into other forms, suggesting tension and balance. Next slide, please. Then the landscape again. So before I came to America in 1983, I went to Santorini to visit a friend who was on a Greek government scholarship. I went to Santorini, which was just an extraordinarily beautiful place. And my first real experience of volcanic landscape. And Greece, anyway, is a country to which I have a huge attraction. I don't know why, beyond obvious things of its landscape and people, but there's a sense of almost I've been here before, but I'm not sure what that might mean. Next slide, please. Then I looked to art outside of the immediate Far East and looking to Mughal painting and Persian painting. And I began to realize in some of these cultures that there are no shadows. And I thought, where are the shadows in the art of the Middle East, as we call it, and the Far East? For the most part, up to the 20th century, there are virtually no shadows. And I don't know why that is, but I then began to think about the Abrahamic traditions and their role of the heliocentricity, the role of the body, male body in particular, and this obsession with time. And I realized that in the Eastern traditions, philosophically and spiritually, there's a great deal of emphasis on the idea of duration, continuity, and rebirth, regeneration, cyclical forms. And I thought, so timelessness may be what they're really interested in rather than time itself. Next slide, please. The Western tradition, the mysteries in the Catholic traditions, is Zurbarán, great painter of the Spanish school. These things are where I came from, but I was looking to other cultures because there was more information I needed. These were beautiful, and they weren't all there might be, so I kept looking. Next slide, please. I came across Gorky, one of the great abstract expressionists, Armenian-born, but great, ultimately American painter, who was extraordinarily informative to me, allowing me to think about abstraction and figuration equally. Next slide, please. Matter, who was deeply influenced, an influence on Gorky and others. Gordon Onslow Ford, who I don't have a slide of, unfortunately, is one of the great artists of that era. The abstract surrealists were a very important group. And I think Mata was somebody who spoke about the idea again, what is visible, what is invisible. And as a painter, you see something, but what it is it you're actually seeing? And these things became very intriguing to me. Next slide, please. Tarkovsky, one of the great Soviet filmmakers and a poet in his own right, a mystical, Christian mystic, and deeply philosophical. His films have a very special place in my sort of visual lexicon internally. And soundscapes too. His soundscapes are extraordinary. The musician he uses for nearly all of his films does something very special. But again, cinema is often at the periphery of my consciousness. Next one, please. Next one, please. There's just stills from Tarkovsky films. Then here's some of my paintings from about the 90s through. Let's go through these fairly quickly because many of you know my work, so I don't spend too much time on this. The landscape is hovering. America, I went out to see Yosemite, get to Utah, and saw the great landscapes of the West. So they were beginning to become part of my consciousness. Yeah, perfect. And Iceland was another place I went. First ever icebergs, very exciting. So I make paintings. And now this idea of how do I paint rather than just paint what I see, but how does what I see affect what I'm feeling and what I'm sensing? Next one, please. Ongoing. Yep. Then another film that's hugely important is Lost Horizon. This idea of cinema as fantasy. And Lost Horizon actually is a term that gave us the term Shangri-La, based on a James Hilton novel. Shangri-La is La is Tibetan for past. It's where you go over a mountainscape from one part to another, one valley to another. And so this is Black Narcissus, another film. The Himalaya began to become part of my experience of the world, and they became more and more intriguing to me as this remote and beautiful part of the world where strange things might happen. Keep going. Thank you. So I went on my own trip with a guide, of course, and a group of other people. But my first experience, and this is Chola in Himalaya, which I crossed in 2003. Very exciting 4-week trek to the base camp of Everest. And it was life-changing because I stood up on this landscape looking at Everest a few days after this photograph was taken. And I was taking in the vastness of what I was looking at and the absolute beauty. And I was crying like a baby because I was working through my memory and of a marriage that failed and of the death of my brother when I was 34 and he was 38 and the sadness of that and wondering why my brother couldn't be with me there and then. And in fact, he was probably in the end. But, I was in a very emotional state and then it cleared and I felt this calmness in this beautiful space. And then I said to myself, nothing, nothing, nothingness, nothing, nothing, nothingness, over and over again. And I began to realize, I said, oh, that's why I've come here. This is why I came. Nothingness. Everything is connected. Our Buddhist friends are wise people. Our Taoist friends are wise people. Any religion at its very highest and least zealous is a wonderful thing, if that's the prism through which you see. For me, the Eastern portal gave me what I was looking for. And then I realized as a painter, I do not want to paint merely what I see, but to create a kind of recognition of existence itself. Painting is a register for me. That's how I do it. Poets do it, writers do it, any number of things, ways you do it. For me, painting was a way that I archive consciousness. Next slide, please. When I looked to the East and I saw the mandala forms, Thangka paintings in Nepal when I was visiting there, and this idea of the visualization of that which is otherwise invisible or really concept. And so, of course, early ventures in East and Western art, Cubism, and eventually the art that came out of Cubism was really about breaking down that illusionistic order of things. But this idea in the Far East, as I understood it, was this idea of inner geometries and these ideas of understanding forms of picture making, which were not image making, they were actual visual presences. And that's something I'm also intrigued by, this idea of image, because image is always an after effect. Image is, none of your images except those I'm seeing on screen now, but in person you are a real being. So an image is all to do with an echo. And I wanted to get, as Robert Irwin talked to the idea of the first order of presence. Next slide, please. That's the Himalayan base camp. That's the base camp of Everest that I went to. Next slide, please. And we'll go through these fairly quickly because we're running out of time and I want to touch on a few more things. All of these about 5, 6 foot. Every painting is, oh, this is just when I was in China giving demonstrations with my friend Ren Ming. We've done many times. I now am also a visiting professor at the Shanghai University and an Academy of Art, where I'm the mentor, PhD student mentor, and I go and lecture there on Zoom and other things. Okay, so keep going. And these are the projects I did in China with Ren Ming. We did a project in the I'm trying to remember the Lushan Academy in the Shenyang province. So these are combination paintings where he's using Eastern paintings and I'm using acrylic paint. We're talking to the students about synthesis. Carry on. Thank you. Yeah. Just a landscape shot, places I saw, effects it had upon me. Wales. This old mirror that I found in my cottage, and I got fox marked, and I took it outside. It hadn't been outside for at least 100 years, so I thought I'd photograph the landscape. And I just love the idea of the idea of a reflection which is corrupted by time. So I thought, well, that's a project for future. Then I started realizing in my paintings I was interested in these ideas of erosion as well as presence. So a lot of these just close-ups are part of my paintings. Everything is acrylic. Sometimes it's photographs. This is photographs. Most of it's without photographs. The photographs are often referenced. It's a show I had in Wales with two friends in the Tenby, a small museum in Wales where my grandmother was born. My Welsh connection enabled me to be part of that show, and it's very touching. And I showed my work, and they were quite an orthodox and conservative group. But this one chap came up who was a local chap who'd been an art teacher in a local school, and he said, "I never liked abstraction until I saw you work because I realized it's not abstract." I said, "Thank you," and I was very happy. He said, "I can see where you go to make these paintings." This is my studio when it was tidy. I couldn't take that photograph now, sadly. I need to make it tidy again. I have a studio in San Rafael, which is my chamber, my sanctuary. Some of you have been there, so you know it. All of these are acrylic. I studied an oil painting, but I got given acrylic when I was at grad school. Okay, so these are more recent ones. This is a silk-covered piece. I've been exploring silk because I wanted to. My concern is cultural appropriation without thoughtfulness, and I don't want that, obviously. So I'm trying as a Western artist, looking to my Chinese contemporaries and historical figures, getting permission to try and speak in perhaps a hybrid language. I don't speak Chinese. I'm trying to learn. I'm very bad with language. I speak a little bit of French and that's it. I'm still trying to learn Chinese. But in painting terms, I want to enter into that mind space. And so what I started doing is working with faux silk and combining silk with canvas to create these hybrids, what I'm calling your chimera. Keep going. The next one. The Northern Lights was, I recommend to anybody who's got any interest in natural phenomena, make that on your bucket list. You'll never regret it. Fantastic experience. So I'm feeding myself with things that I see, then things how they internalize within, what comes forth from improvisation. Every painting you've seen was unplanned, other than the size. Okay, now I think Maria Teresa, if we can make some of these should become animated. So these are alcohol ink paintings that I'm recently working on. And I make them. One of our guests today, I think Colette's there. I think hopefully she's going to help me because she's actually a filmmaker, apart from being a marvelous artist in other areas. She's going to help me film these because I'm doing this with my iPhone while I'm making them. And the beautiful thing about this material, the alcohol ink, none of this is done by hand. I pour materials and I move the surface of the paper to create the image. So it's a totally different way of becoming in relationship to the visual forms. And what I'm intrigued by is the rheology, the actual flow of the paint itself, because every gesture has that. But these are gestures that you see in motion, but they are still painting, and yet they're filmic at the same time. And I find them very, very engaging. There we go. Now I breathe on them. Sounds a bit like a stalker movie, but I do usually put music to them now because you breathe on them to make them move, but they respond to your breath. So it made me think about the idea of chi and energy. So these flowing forms become very mesmerizing. And when they finish, they're nice pieces. But I love this idea of record without seeing a brush moving around to make things. It's just gravity and liquidity that allows them to do their thing. So that's what I'm working on right now, along with, I basically add to the milieu. So I do collages, work on multiple scales, which then I find sometimes working small, I think much larger than when I work big. Sometimes I think big when I'm working small, I think big, and vice versa. But this new material, the alcohol ink, is interesting because of its fluidity, which I find particularly engaging. That's the last slide. Then sometimes I have them printed on metal. One of my grads put me onto this company called Bay Photograph, and you send them a USB image, and they'll give them, they do the color check with you, and then they print it, and that's what you end up with. So that's where we are now. Thank you for your patience and time. This is a stage now which is going to open up new possibilities. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Jeremy, for being so generous with your work and with your background and your history. And yeah, we're collecting any questions you might have in the chat. We have a couple more minutes for any questions, and then we still have time for a little happy birthday for Jeremy. So we got a lot of thank yous, Jeremy, in the chat.
Good, thank you. Thank you.
A lot of thank yous. What a lovely talk, Jeremy. That was Beth Hurt and from Claire Thomas. And yeah, it was just inspiring, wonderful. I think everyone is just so grateful for what you shared with us. And
well, my pleasure. Thank you for your time. So, I think it's nice. I mean, we're all, doing our things, and we did them sometimes very differently, but we're all connected by whatever we call this creative urge. It's just something we're born with a capacity or desire to experience. And maybe, so, for me, there was a quote from a poem. I can't remember the source. I'm trying to remember, but the line was very important. When I went with my mother on a short vacation after my brother died, I have to sort of get away from home where everything had happened, and we were in a little country hotel, and there was a book there at the beginning then of that awful Iraq war, the first one. And I was, everything was very tender and sensitive. And I picked up this book. It was about a British colonial that had gone to India, supposedly to, do work civilizing the Indian people. And of course, he gets there and realizes he was the one that needed civilizing. So after he goes there, he eventually leaves the army and marries a Hindu and takes up Hinduism, lives a life in India. And in his reflections, in the frontispiece of this book, somebody wrote, "He left to seek strange truths in undiscovered lands." And I love that line. And I thought, that's what I feel when I go into my studio. That's how I felt when I came into the classroom. Because each time I came into that space we called the Art Institute, it was like an undiscovered land, because it was never the same. It had a familiarity and a strangeness all at the same time, which made it very special. So I'm deeply grateful to all of my students and all of the community of SFAI, because it wasn't a perfect place, but when it was good, it was fabulous. And I think we can all agree on that. So I'm happy to have been part of it. I'm deeply honored to be part of it.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I'm going to stop the recording now.